It's a fancy song. I always like Taylor Swift.
Absolutely.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Untethered Mind and our very first live stream, which is why you can understand where we're late trying to set it up. And that is not on me. This is the platform we're on. But today is exciting because I've never done a live stream with a Muslim before. Maybe I have. I don't know. Um, not in recent times anyway. And I think it is going to be a really good perspective to kind of have both of us, with our, professional experiences, but also I think mostly you, Ashraf, you are a professor in social anthropology. And Ashraf and I got in touch via Twitter when I heard his radio segment on the migration conversations that were happening in the UK. And I thought it was really nice to kind of pair up, like, me looking at numbers and writing what I think is also a bias piece, but also getting Ashraf's insight and, the book you've written, but also what you're contributing in your professional life as well. But before I give away too much about your introduction, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Zara. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really glad to be here. So my name is Ashraf Hoque. I'm a associate professor of social anthropology at UCL, University College London. And my work intersects with various sort of topics, most prominently the anthropology of Islam, migration and diaspora studies, and the politics and economics of South Asia. So my work broadly covers those particular areas, and I come at it through a sort of qualitative, ethnographic, bottom-up gaze.
Yeah, and I think this was a good pairing because I was looking at it from, all the, I guess, the Twitter news that we have, and also trying to pair that up with just the statistics sides of it, because I see a lot of misinformation happening on Twitter. Maybe there is a valid claim to it, but it's also, like, in my perspective, any data you see obviously is open to interpretation as well.
Mm.
But Ashraf, tell us a bit more about how you see the current protests and the riots that are happening in the UK, and what do you think led up to that, and where are we at now?
Mm. Well, there's lots of things to talk about there. I should have actually mentioned in my introduction that I wrote a book called Being Young, Male and Muslim in Luton. Um, and the research for that was conducted in the aftermath of the London 7/7 bombing. So some of people might be aware that we had our own Muslim terrorist attacks in London in 2005. And that book was the final sort of result of my doctoral work. So in that post 7/7 world, I was working with young male Muslims in Luton, which was seen at the time as a hotbed of Islamic radicalization, Islamist radicalization. So my book really tries to go beyond the statistics, as you mentioned at the top there, Zara, and all the sort of what I thought was very fragmentary information in the public sphere, and tries to sort of unearth what exactly are these modern day folk devils, these young male Muslims in the West. Are their lives about? And the book basically finds two things. One is that young men in Luton were really proud of the fact that they were from Luton, really happy to be in Luton, despite it being a post-industrial landscape where there's lots of social inequalities. So they were very jealously protective of Luton. They really were happy to be there because a lot of them said that they were free to practice their identity in Luton. And the other acute finding from that study was that despite feeling very British, and everybody said that they were British first when asked, where are you from? They said, well, I'm British Muslim, I'm British Pakistani, British Bangladeshi, etc. Despite feeling very British, they felt a lot of pressure and a lot of external gaze on their communities in the aftermath of 9/11, so the war on terror. So if you remember that whole decade, and some of us are old enough to remember it all, in that time, there was a lot of pressure on Muslims in the West. There was a lot of media discourse around it. There was lots of policy making in Britain, for example. We had the Prevent programme, which was highly unsuccessful, has gone through various iterations because it's targeting a specific community and asking
Can
people
you
to want to.
can
Yeah.
you tell me a bit more about the Prevent program?
Well, I mean, again, this is a long story, so I'll try to make it as brief as possible. The Prevent programme was initiated by the Labour government in the aftermath of 9/11 and sort of tried to prevent homegrown terrorism. It was part of this wider strategy for social order. And throughout the years, it's gone through various iterations because it's just not worked. Every time they've tried to reformulate it, it's ended up not producing any results or having the sort of contrary effect. So essentially, what it is a government policy whereby they distinguish between good Muslims and bad Muslims. So good Muslims being those who don't like terrorists, and bad Muslims being the terrorists. And they rely on community networks and community intelligence and inter-community collaborations to unearth and de-radicalize potential radicals in the community. So that's caused, as you can imagine, so many problems because people are like, well, you're asking us to police our own communities. There's a loaded assumption that somehow it's to do with Islam and not other factors, social, economic, political factors. This is creating ironically, a two-tier society or policing model. And unsurprisingly, lots of people didn't collaborate with the authorities. So they're still trying, they're in their sort of latest iteration, which might be sort of version 5.0, 6.0, something like that, where they're mindful of all of these, they've got all of this feedback back, the government, and they're sort of very aware that this is causing issues. So they're trying to re-articulate it again, but again, it's always going to be a problem when you're directing a particular population group, and particularly. Sorry.
I was going to say, I guess it also causes further isolation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is one of the things I was saying, that the two sort of major findings of my research in Luton was that, one, that people felt very British, very strongly connected to their town, to the wider country. But secondly, rather paradoxically, they also felt under pressure to conform in a way that other citizens don't. And they were very well aware of the perception of Muslims, the sort of broader, wider social perceptions of Muslims. So that then links into the question I think that you asked, is that, what are these riots all about? And again, it's a really complicated answer. There's various nodes that sort of came together that was sort of expressed and articulated in those riots. First of all, let's start from sort of the present backwards. We've had, since 2010, a Conservative government in Britain. Throughout that time, they have been instigating policies of austerity. So for those of people who might not be aware what British austerity looks like, it's in the aftermath of the banking crisis in the sort of late noughties. The Conservative government came in 2010 on the back of, we are the Tories, we can manage the economy better than anybody, their whole traditional shtick. And throughout their term, and they were in power since 2010, so throughout that entire duration, aside from maybe the last year, we've had austerity policies in the UK, which is essentially the shrinking of the state, cutting government funding. This has had a massive impact on many, many communities across the UK. And because we've had austerity, the numbers of migrants that have been coming into the UK, because the UK needs migrants, it needs actually low skilled or no skilled. It's always difficult to describe people with no skills. They obviously have got skills, but this is how it's expressed politically. So people of low skills who are coming over here doing jobs that if they didn't do, our economy would collapse. Mostly it's in the services sector or care sector or health sector, and they're working antisocial hours for very little pay in comparison to the national averages. So migrants have been coming in. we've had a policy in the UK since Blair's time in the early 2000s where migrants were to be scattered around the country. So, the asylum seekers as well as new migrants would be housed in various parts of the country, not centralized in the sort of area that they first come and reside in. So what's happened is that this extra influx of people, in combination with austerity, has created situations where the public services are on their knees. Obviously, coronavirus has contributed to that as well. The recent sort of hike in utility prices, fuel prices, because of geopolitical developments, has also played a factor. So throughout this time, the government sort of tried to blame migration for a lot of these problems. We've got too many people. This is the legacy of the previous government, which is something that they always do. But then around about halfway through the tenure of the last Conservative government, we had the Brexit vote, which was completely won on this populist anti-immigration ticket. So then what you had is that the Tories went further in that direction. There's the hostile environment for anti-immigrants because they realize it wins elections. There's a Stop the Boat campaign that we had recently, where we had our Home Minister Suella Braverman saying that we're being swamped by migrants, speaking about migrants as some kind of disease, dehumanizing rhetoric. And this is whipped up. We've got Nigel Farage, who's our sort of far-right populist cheerleader, who comes out and says really populist things because he knows that there's a base for that, and he knows that the Conservative Party is split between those people who agree with that anti-immigration stance and those people who are more centrist. So this is the most recent sort of, it's electoral, it's political decisions since sort of 2010. But I would argue that before that, we've led up to this sort of anti-immigration sentiment in the UK is linked to anti-Muslim sentiment or Islamophobia as well. And that was whipped up in the sort of post 9/11 war on terror era, which obviously is linked to geopolitics. There are wider foreign policy implications there as well. Lots of migrants, asylum seekers that come to Britain are from Syria, are from Iraq, are from Afghanistan, are from Libya. So they're all places that Britain directly went and got involved in regime change or had wars, participated in wars. On top of that, we've got a huge colonial legacy in the UK. Obviously, Britain was part of the biggest empire the world has ever known. It has tentacles still to this day, social, political, economic, across the world. A lot of those people come to the UK. People, for example, in Afghanistan might have family in the UK. They would rather come to Afghanistan than claim asylum in Ukraine, for example, claim asylum in Germany, for example. Which,
I
by
mean,
the way, is totally
my
legal. Sorry?
my parents are British nationals and they've never lived in the UK, so their birth certificate is British, and technically they can move to the UK at any point,
Absolutely.
and that's like pre-East African independence as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, we had the whole, you would know then, Zara, that we've got this, in the 70s, we had huge influxes of what sociologists call twice migrants. So people from Tanzania, Kenya, Idi Amin's regime, Uganda. People came and they were British. They were literally stateless at the time because they couldn't go back to India because it was so many generations back, and they were part of the British Empire. And I should also mention that according to the UN, Refugees Convention of '51, it's not necessary for you to seek asylum at the first place. The chart is much more complicated. You go where there's a dignity involved, where you go where you have family or you have people who can support you, a regime where you feel comfortable. It's all about human rights.
But
Um,
is that different to the Dublin Convention for asylum seekers, where I guess they don't have family involved, but they land somewhere in the EU, for instance,
mhm, mhm.
or if they land in the UK and then try to move to the EU?
Yeah. This is this is complicated because every region has its own jurisdiction, right? So Britain has lots of immigration acts
Mm.
that it works around the skeleton definitions, right? Britain exploits that, for example. So the Rwanda bill that we had, so where we had the Tories propose this thing about sending people to Rwanda as a deterrent. Um, in the end, our own Supreme Court ruled that was illegal, but they could have made an argument to make that. I mean, the Tories in the end did. They said when it was perfectly safe. The Supreme Court said it was illegal because Rwanda isn't safe. The Tories then turned around and sort of cooked it in a way that showed that Rwanda is safe, right? So this goes against, if you like, the spirit of the convention, where Britain is saying, look, we're still trying to process these people; they're still under our jurisdiction, but it goes against the spirit of the original law. But the point I'm trying to make is that we've got lots of immigration that comes to this country as a result of our historic footprint on this planet, and Britain should, own up to that, declare that, accept that. No, the political class, nobody dares to say anything about that because they know it's political suicide. And secondly, again, the political class have totally failed. In this case, the Tory government, which has been in power since 2010, has totally failed in trying to maintain how people are received, the social services and public services that people receive, and that's creating huge resentment. So there's some places in Britain where the entire contour, of towns and villages, particularly poor places, have been completely changed. The shops have changed. There's all sorts of different kinds of shops from around the world that's come in. People have come in who, are then taking up public services. They're going to the GP, they're going to the schools, they're using the hospitals.
But then isn't that very, I guess it's a catch-22 where when immigrants come in, they want to be close to, what is culture like for them or similar to their cultures. At the
Absolutely.
same time, I feel the government does not take responsibility in segregating them a bit so they can get acquainted with more of the British culture as well. And that almost as though they don't want to get their hands dirty. They would rather like, okay, guys, stay here and really just band-aid it every time until it builds up into what has been, I feel like, what has been happening now when there's a clash of cultures just between suburbs as well.
No, precisely. Well, what they've done actually, Zara, is they've flip-flopped between those two policies. So initially, they put people in one place. Well, I mean, that happened more organically because people in the post-war period, so lots of people from the Caribbean, the Windrush generation, and people from South Asia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. When they came as chain migration. So somebody would come from a village, they'll say, oh, there are jobs here. So their next door neighbor would come, their cousins will come, and they would obviously naturally congregate in certain areas of the city, right, where the rents were cheaper. Now, where the rents were cheaper was also where the other working classes of this country, historic sort of legacy working classes, also lived. So in this case, in Britain, in the northern towns, white working classes also lived. But then as more and more migrants came, white working classes moved out of these areas, what they called, sociologists again call white flight, and moved to sort of the edges of these towns. And then separation, segregation, bedded in then. So you found schools which are 100% Pakistani in some towns, 100% white English in the other part of the town. And so we had a sort of towns and cities where they were very, very segregated along ethnicity and race. But then that led to all sorts of riots throughout the 20th century. We had the riots, incidentally, just a few months before the 9/11 bombings in 2001 in some of our northern towns, so Oldham, Bradford, and Burnley, where Asian children, young men, were rioting against far-right groups coming and marching through their areas and, breaking up shops and properties and people's homes. The government then commissioned a report after that, investigating it, and that report, called the Canton Report of 2001, concluded that these places are too segregated. We need to find ways of getting communities to mix. Okay. So then, off the back of that, the Blair government tried to do something about it. They tried to do the scattering things, as you mentioned. So when people come, they're sent off to different parts of the country so that they can integrate. But what you found there was that people were coming in, and already these places had anti-immigrant sentiment, right? So they're more sort of Brexit, if you like, later the Brexit voting people didn't like immigrants because they were poor areas. And that's what led to now the resentment that we saw a few weeks ago. Because if you study where that happened, all the places, Hartlepool, Southport, Rotherham, Blackburn, these are all ex-mill towns, mining towns. These are all post-industrial landscapes where communities for generations have been devastated by the loss of their trades or the loss of their industries. coal, manufacturing of cloth, manufacturing of vehicles. In Luton, for example, it used to be the Vauxhall motor company used to be based there. Lots of Muslims who are there, lots of ethnic minorities and working classes just work into that factory. But this has all been closed down. Lots of people in these areas are, they feel like they've been left behind. So those, I mean, well, just to say, Zara, they've tried to do that, and they've also messed it up because fundamentally they've let down the working classes. So all of those people, migrants who've come in, white working classes, and not invested in these communities and just taken their votes for granted, essentially. And this was the outbreak of that resentment.
I mean, almost as though they didn't actually learn from the history itself. If it's happened before and it's happening continuously as we're going on a cycle. I mean, for me, I mean, I've been in the West for 16 years, so like it's still relatively new to me to go through what is happening in, I guess, in Sweden, but also what has happened in the UK and how different Australia is as well. So I've lived it most of my adult life in Australia. But what I see as a theme, especially in Europe and UK, is that, there's always this clash of cultures and it's happening on both ends. And almost always it is, majority is the working class. It is, people, I want to say, who are not well educated on the complexities of what happens when migrants come in. What does the integration look like? What is, actually being there for the community to, thrive look like as well. And then on the other side, it's really, we get a lot of people who are educated, who do, like, especially right now in the era of social media, who do fall into, like, don't want to say propaganda, but very biased news. Right? Social media has now gone towards, instead of reading up any history, any numbers, they look at a chart that somebody has made, they form their opinions on it, and then, you will have a lot of people who are, I would have hoped so, well learned about the topic, would at least be a bit more informed. I guess the radio you were on, I can't remember what radio channel that was on.
It was BBC Radio 4, Moral
Yeah.
Maze, I think the program was.
Yeah, and that was like a 2 minute, that was like a really quick 2 minute. I feel like there was a lot of streamroll, like, being streamrolled in that podcast as well, or like in the radio segment as well. But also off of it, you'd see, Constantine actually, I actually like some of his debates to continue talking about illegal migration, but not actually kind of supporting that with like, wait, hang on, aren't you a migrant as well? Because the people who are actually against illegal migration, I guess the natives, who are against illegal migrants, they don't seem to like categorize between like who's a good migrant and who's a bad migrant. They see, all as one. And likewise, as, people of color, when you're a recipient of so much and being in a hostile environment, you don't tend to also make that differences between, is this person going to attack me or racially abuse me, or should I just avoid it in general, or should I just put my guard up as well? And it goes on both sides. Like, you're just being stressed where like the middle, where people are bringing in nuanced topics, are not being heard.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. But, just to throw in some cynicism, there's a lot of political short-termism that's resulted in this, Zara, in my view. You say, you mentioned the point about educated people and uneducated people, and that is, in my opinion, very very well known by politicians, right? They know what will get votes. That's the first point. The second thing is short-termism. So it's linked to the electioneering. They might think that migration is a great boon for society. They might think, of course, most migrants aren't this. They might even be migrants themselves. They might even have family who are migrants, right? But in their view, they're like, okay, what is it that we need to do to win this election and stay in power, right? And that's been the tactic throughout. And immigration, I mean, we're sort of bordering into sort of political philosophy here, or the critique of liberal democracies, right? Where you've got 5 years and then you have to get elected again, and you've got another 5 years and get elected again. So this is fundamentally a critique of liberal democracy. Can liberal democracy provide produce a society where you do get to have intelligent, thorough conversations in the civil societies, right? Most migration scholars, for example, um, are pro-migration. Why? You know, these are people that have spent their lives digging into it, trying to balance out objectively whether it's a net, you know, uh, good, social good or not. You know, and invariably all of them say the same thing. They say, look, you know, bounded, essentialized conceptions of cultures is dumb. It's not. It's not the case. Cultures always move. It shifts. You know, so they can show through research that sort of bounded identities, bounded national identities, is absurd. It's a fantasy. It doesn't work. Secondly, that people have always migrated. You know, Britain, ironically, is a nation that's been invaded many times by people from lots of different places. Okay, we're the sum of all of those things, and I believe that's what makes us. You know, if we are great, that's why we are great. Okay, they'll know that. The scholars also see how migration has an impact on social, economic, political phenomena and factors within society, and they think it's a net gain, right? But in order to think like that, you have to go off and, you know, do a few degrees, spend your life in research. Most people don't have the time to do that. Most people pick up a newspaper, on the front page there's some scare story, you know, your kids are eating halal food or something like that. They get
Not
frightened.
even.
Stop this, you know?
Not
Yeah,
even
not even.
anymore.
Yeah.
Not even anymore.
Mm,
I mean, like I said, like a lot of like X right now is trending as like the news source,
mm,
the news source based on a lot of people hiding behind a screen, a
yeah.
lot of people, um, you know, quoting what they feel like as factual truth without
Mm,
any evidence, and that
mm,
is considered the truth. On
mm,
the other side,
mm,
what classic media would not show as well
mm,
is out there as well, like it's out there anyway. And then,
mm,
of course, not making it even more complex, that we have AI,
yeah.
fabricated images and videos as well. All
Mm,
of them contributing to what changes our or what builds our perception and our views and opinions.
mm,
And I kind of wanted to go into that on like how has social media, especially now, as compared to the previous riots or the previous tensions between migrant groups and other groups, played into what is happening now. Because
oh, totally. Yeah.
it seems like politicians aside, a lot of people are using that as a platform to, I want to say, spread hate.
Mm,
I don't see a lot of love, unfortunately. I would have liked to. I don't see a lot of support. I know for ex-Muslims, like, there has been a lot of support, being persecuted
mm,
around Muslim majority countries, but also in the West, like, being very isolated.
mm,
But at the moment, it works as a form to spread a lot of, one, misinformation, but also, create more division than it has.
mm,
And that's where you get a lot of people, like even politicians jumping in on it and creating more votes through social media.
mm, mm,
That's
mm,
that's that's how they create public narrative to form or move towards
mm.
their favor as well.
Absolutely, I totally agree. I mean, this is to go back to your question at the top, Zara, where you asked, you know, what caused these riots. This is another node of that, a really, really crucial major node of what led to that, right? Um, you had people, you know, Tommy Robinson coming out, Andrew Tate coming out, Nigel Farage immediately out, you know, Douglas Murray, all of these really sort of big right wing, far right, hate fueled ideologues um, came out and started reposting or creating misinformation, you know, and that got people really riled up. There was another case that
Also,
I,
I think also selective information as well.
mm,
Not all, I feel like not all they've said is misinformation. It's very selected as well
mm,
into like, what can I pick from this? And sometimes I feel like there could be like, legitimate concerns, but there's phrasing, there is the following you have,
mm,
there's also the violence that comes, as part parcel of what you're saying
mm.
when you have a big platform as well.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
sorry, go on. I
no, no, no,
interrupted
no,
you.
it's true. And again, one has to question the level of cynicism here, right? Are they, what's in it for them? Okay. And if you see people are lying in a swimming pool out in Cyprus, or people are in their mansions in Romania, very far away from the riots, or Farage is in his country house, millions and millions, hundreds of miles away from the northern towns, then you have to beg the question, what's in it for them? What's their intention? But totally, social media was a huge logistical component factor behind the recent riots. And just, you might be aware of this as well, Zara. A couple of years ago, in Leicester, which you mentioned, sort of East African migrants to the UK, Leicester, which has a huge East African population. It's the only city now, I think, or the first city in Britain which had a majority non-white population. It's that mixed, that diverse. Um, you had riots between Hindus and Muslims there in the aftermath of a cricket match between Pakistan and India. Um, India won and started marching in Muslim areas of Leicester, right? But then social media in India, especially the BJP, RSS, hard right in India, they're very big with the diaspora. They get a lot of money from the diaspora, and a lot of their support comes from the diaspora. So most people who are Hindu in the UK have some connection to the Hindutva Sangh Parivar. Their whole they do a lot of social and religious work in the UK and other countries where India has a big diaspora. So their social media profiles were going wild. At the same time, you have a lot of sort of British Muslim communities as well, British Muslim podcasters. So I don't know if you know Mohammed Hijab. He's a sort of big YouTuber, um, sort of Wahhabi.
I've had run-ins with him.
Have you? Yeah,
He's
I'm sure you have.
no, it was in
Very
Speaker's
unpleasant.
Corner where I guess it wasn't Muhammad Ujjah, but it was Ali Jawa,
Yeah, he was.
and
He turned up in Leicester as well. Both of them turned up.
yeah, and of course they did. Like
Mm.
and then you have like one of those supporters who were literally like, one, they shamed me over not covering my hair, and because my arms were showing, and like let's say I had like I had, or maybe actually it was just a t-shirt. They covered my neck and everything on their video, and they couldn't fathom that I was from Tanzania as an ex-Muslim, and they're like, "Where's Tanzania?" I mean, they just expected that I would be from Pakistan, India, some Arab country. And I'm like, it's in East Africa, like we exist as a population. Um, but, I had some of their followers who actually threatened me, and I had it on video. And, the sad part about UK policing, and this might go into an alternate, narrative of two-tier policing, was the police was like, oh, don't go back to Hyde Park. And I'm like, hang on. Would you say the same if it was a white person threatening a Muslim woman? And bless her, like she was like a young, like I could tell on the phone, she was like a young female. And she's like, I don't know what to do with this. Like this, this
Mm.
is what I've been told. And I don't know if there's anything I can do. And I'm like, it's fine. Like it's
Yeah.
not that I expected much. But it was also like one of those things that, you've had, on the alternate side that the British police are unable to do anything about the radical crowd as well.
Mm.
I think, was it one of the arena bombings where they didn't want to identify the person because of their race? And that's I feel like all of us, and like I don't mean me and you, but like the general public is also responsible for putting, national security at risk with this I want to say this race riots,
Mm.
where we've kind of either, I feel, I could be wrong, where
Mm.
we've kind of either we've made people to second guess their opinions that
Mm.
could potentially be up for discussion, because we're so easy to call them. I know you've used the term far right a lot, and
Mm.
sometimes I would agree with you, but what I'm trying to do now is like get out of labels and
Mm.
actually look at
Mm.
like what they're saying, because I
Sure.
feel like sometimes I could form like a better way to actually counter that. And right now a lot of those labels are becoming meaningless. Like we've seen actual people do the Nazi salute, and that has been spreading. But I was going to say that I feel like a lot of the public is responsible for creating a lot more division into legitimate concerns that could come about, I guess, popularizing the term Islamophobia into like, and conflating that with anti-Muslim bigotry, which I think a lot of ex-Muslims like to differentiate, including myself, but also then ignoring actual concerns that people like Tommy Robinson, I'm sure other people as well, would bring about. What his documentary, I don't know if you actually saw it. I saw part of his documentary where he just goes to the asylum hotel, corners asylum seekers into like, oh, they're getting everything for free. And I'm like, sure, like that, what he said there is not racist, right? But what he was alluding to was very much like targeting minority. It was targeting vulnerable people who also happen to be people of color. Not necessarily Muslims, but they do happen to be people of color. They are painted as like freeloaders when asylum seeking is everyone's human right.
Mm. Mm.
Um, and
And
that's
on that point as well, Zara, a lot of people don't really realise, certainly in the UK context, asylum seekers are only in hotels because they're not being processed. So it's a
yes,
failure of government. Okay,
exactly.
that's why they're
I work. So to me, like I work with a lot of ex-Muslim like cases, not just in the UK, but like
there.
a lot in the EU, but also the US here
Mm.
and there wherever I'm needed. And it's a small pool of people, but I have worked with like people who, I mean, I only know a small number of cases who've been waiting 4 years for resettlement.
Mm.
And then not only do you go in and, criticize those people, but they're not able to work. They're likely going to be exploited, like
Mm.
with, table, like cash under the table.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're doing now is you're then blaming them for wanting to survive, to
Mm.
get their basic needs met, because you don't know how to process them. You're not making it faster. I'm sure, like if you want to deport, like if you want to reject an asylum, if you had better processes, instead of them draining your resources
Mm.
by being in an asylum hotel, they can actually contribute to the environment, or they can contribute to the society much quicker.
Mm.
And that could be a better process and less burden on the state as well.
Mm.
um, and that's the thing, right? Like a lot of people don't realize that when somebody is claiming asylum, like yes, there is a fraction that are not eligible for it, that come on false pretenses.
Mm.
However, at the same time, the majority of them, you know they're taking ages to process,
Mm. Mm.
and all they're doing is just continuing that, I want to say, that drain of resources when they can be better, when they can contribute quite quickly to the society. And if anything, if there is the concerns about asylum seekers or people come by boats are going to are committing more crime, you would know that. You would know that much sooner than waiting for 4 years until they get that. And
Mm-hmm.
then now you spent a longer time to blame the same people.
Mm. Exactly. I mean, it's like I said at the top. If people actually knew about these issues more, they would not come to the anti-asylum seeker position. They wouldn't, in other words, they wouldn't blame the asylum seeker, and they
Yeah.
would understand that if you process the asylum seeker, yes, they're going to contribute to the society, they're going to get the economy going, all the things that people are obsessed about, certainly in Britain, bills, um,
It was also
living
like
rates.
majority of people who had migrated for work,
Mm.
migrated for study, both of them obviously bringing in more to the economy. And this isn't just low income migration, it's also high income. 30%, like most of them were Indians and Polish people, and a lot of Indians, over 30%, went into healthcare, the
Mm.
healthcare that people are complaining about. So
Mm.
if you're going to stop migration, you have to indiscriminately stop it, all of it. And that
Absolutely.
also means that you're going to put an end to what they can bring. um, at the same time, you're also going to be lacking those skills. And it's not easy. It's actually not easy to get a work permit in the UK.
No, and that's why. Sorry to cut you there, Zara. That's why politicians don't talk about it, because they know that the economy is hinged on that. It's a the left on this, or progressive elements in British society, have been totally impotent because they don't want to talk about it. And in the absence of them talking about it, you've got You know, I know you problematized the use of the word right, but I'm using it just for the sake
No,
of
I get
argument
it.
here. You've got the right here who are coming in and saying, well, actually, we can make a lot of hay, you know, from this situation, and that's what's happened. People are being misinformed. They have no trust in the political class. They get their news from people like Tommy Robinson, who's a grifter. I mean, let's face it. This guy is making money. He's satiating his ego. He's a celebrity. He gets things paid for him. He comes from nothing. You know, so he's a
I mean,
chance.
I mean, the argument I've heard is, I guess elitism,
Mm,
right? Like he hasn't studied. But I don't
mm,
think ignorance is an argument anymore. My parents never went to high school and they would never
mm.
talk the same way,
Exactly.
right? Like my sisters, like none of them went beyond high school. Like, they like, no, my parents never went beyond like high school. So they would never talk. It's not the same,
No, no,
right?
absolutely not.
I feel like education is, on you, and
Yeah,
how you present yourself is definitely on you.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
But
but
the point, yeah, sorry.
But do you feel, if I play the devil's advocate here,
Hmm. Hmm.
because I don't, I want to bring in the arguments of me not agreeing with you.
Hmm.
I think I
Okay.
mentioned that. Okay, cool. Do you feel that with okay, names aside, Tommy Robinson, Douglas Murray, etc. Do you feel that there is legit concerns about national security and nationalism within this riots? Even the uninformed can have validity to, like, protest,
Mm,
because the working class, or a lot of, like, not just the working class, white British people see this as an erosion of their culture,
mm.
especially when the negative news kind of surfaces a bit more than what could be, no bad news or positive news.
Mm. I, I definitely think, just as somebody who studied, as an anthropologist, as a sociologist, as professionally, I think that if people are coming out onto the streets and throwing rocks at other people, police, attacking places of worship, we need to take that seriously. As a fact, as a thing that's just happened, we need to take that seriously. And the way to deal with that is try to understand the reasons why that's happened. It's the same applies to British Muslims going to join ISIS.
Mm.
ISIS is a terrible scourge upon humanity, right? And
I like how you had to say that as though it
yeah,
wasn't implied.
no, but I
Because
mean,
you and I would also be the first ones to go at the hands of ISIS.
exactly, but that's why I feel the need. I mean, we're going to a tangent, but I feel the need. Muslims particularly need to say that because we've been barraged with associations, right? So anyway, so they're a scourge. Somebody goes and joins them. They're part of the scourge, right? And that goes without saying. But for me, as an academic, as somebody who looks at these things intellectually, we have to understand why Shamima Begum, for example, decided when she was 15 years old to leave her family and go to Turkey, a country she's never been to, and then go across the border into Syria and Iraq. Why is that? I find that interesting anyway as a migration scholar. But once we get to the grips with that, we'll go somewhere to eradicating, fixing the problem, right?
Have you
So
watched the TV show Caliphate, the Netflix
no, I
one?
haven't. No.
Really good one.
Hmm.
Really good one. It really, like, it's Swedish based, so it's translated, but you can
Okay.
watch it in, like, dubbed.
Hmm.
Really good one where I always quote it to everybody, like, ex-Muslims, Muslims as well, even my family as well. I'm like, I think there is a very important message here,
Mm.
which really kind of highlights, why has ISIS or radical Islamists gotten more support within the younger crowd,
Hmm.
especially because that TV show talks about how, I don't know if they were Iranians or they were Syrians who were actually, like, came from Muslim families, are not believers, moved to Sweden, and then their daughters joined ISIS.
Hmm.
And it was this narrative that the West hates us, right?
Hmm.
It's not even their parents. It is not their parents. And similarly, like, I don't know how many East Africans you know, but I guess we're a bit different than being from Pakistan,
Mm. Mm.
right? Like we come from, like, I guess, a higher class society, education, whatnot.
Mm.
So we come from a very different environment as well. And then I see the kids getting more radicalized than the parents had taught us.
mm,
Things like ISIS, Wahhabism, I didn't know any of that until
mm,
I actually left.
mm,
And then I look at it and I'm like, oh my God, I've been living under a rock. But
mm,
then you turn that perspective around to what's happening in like the West in general is that, you've isolated these groups. Um, there's a part of, the radical Islamists playing into brainwashing the
mm,
children. There is white Swedes who also joined,
mm,
and the common thread there was, there was a part of like wanting to feel connected to the religion that has been so criticized.
mm,
But also with the white Swedes joining, it all came down to poor socioeconomics, not having meaning.
mm,
And they were like, oh, but this religion can give you meaning, and if you kill for it,
mm,
it'll give, you will have a purpose.
mm,
So I know King's College does a lot of anti-terror or counterterrorism studies. I actually went to one of them because I was so interested.
mm,
And it was there was like a similar theme when they talk about what are the profiles that join these groups, which is, there's an element of religion, growing up in that religion. There's an element of not feeling like you're part of the society that is around you. And then there's an element of being part of the poor socioeconomic environment as well.
mm. There's health issues as well. On that point, Zara, thank you for that. There's a brilliant book which I really recommend you and your listeners to read, by a lady called Hilary Pilkington, who is called Loud and Proud, and it follows around the EDL, the English Defence League, so the organisation that Tommy Robinson created, um, and it's a brilliant ethnography of its followers.
Mm.
And essentially, you realise exactly those things that you've just talked about there, Zara, where these people come from. Some of them have really troubled backgrounds. They're looking for a sense of community. They look around their communities and see that they're left behind. That there's nothing much left. And when they go on marches, it's like a social. It's like a village fete event. And then because the researcher Pilkington was um, developed relationships with them for over a year, that some extraordinary interviews with female members of EDL, for example, black members of EDL, Sikh members of EDL, where um, you can see that they're very vulnerable, they're very human. A lot of the times we dehumanize these people, right? Because we just think, oh, they're just absolutely Shumaim
The other
Begum.
side.
Yeah, at the end of the day, they're humans, and there's reasons for why they're engaged in that. And it's a brilliant piece of work. It's a great study. But what it shows is that the all it takes is a spark. It takes the radical speech, the Anjem Chowdhuries and the Tommy Robinsons of the world, to be able to attract, or the Andrew Tates of the world, to be able to attract very vulnerable people who are looking for an identity, looking for a sense of belonging, looking for a sense of worth. Whether they're sort of men who feel emasculated, or white people that feel they're being elbowed out of their country, or Muslims who feel the brunt of every single terrorist atrocity or world event that happens in the world, right? So this is what I'm saying. We don't Our parliamentary system doesn't have enough space, or can be bothered to explore these things and talk about these things in a way that's meaningful and educational for the masses. Because if the masses were open to this, would live in a much more vibrant and tolerant society, I think. But it's not. I mean, I'm being really, really doom and gloom. I don't think it's just going to get worse.
I do think that it is going to get worse. But I also feel like this is a good place to be where you can have these conversations, where you can actually have people who are racist, people who do hate
Mm,
non-Muslims, people who do, to actually voice them so that we
mm,
know and we understand. Sometimes also we avoid.
mm,
Some of the conversations are better not to be had
mm,
with people.
mm,
I know Dia Khan also had her documentary on white right as well, which was, quite literally sitting with somebody, just, marching with them as well as a brown woman, and asking them, like, your friends call me shitface. What do you think about that? And, just seeing that person live, like feeling really bad about, what has just happened.
mm,
And really putting it into perspective in a human level
mm,
is, I think, what's missing.
mhm.
not many people have the courage to have dialogues like this.
Mm.
And the reality is that the politicians, that's not going to generate them votes. Having nuance is not going to generate them votes. We have it very similarly in Sweden,
Mm.
where, you know, our far right is very different to what is in the UK. We don't have LGBT issues, we don't have women's rights issues, so it's much what would far right here would be very centrist in the UK. So
Mm.
immigration happens to be one of the topics,
Mm.
but in Sweden that's still considered far right, and that is actually a good thing that we're moving towards a different scale.
Mm.
However, what we'll see here is like the right wing group, because the right wing group were the only ones talking about migration. And like you said, their intentions are what matter. Like, what are they getting out of it?
Mm.
You know, what are they trying to achieve? And the background is that this political group, Swedish Democrats, which I know a lot of people will agree with me, a lot of Swedes tend to tell me that I'm still a Muslim. But Swedish Democrats actually had founders, like literal Nazis, 20 years ago, had the brown uniform. And why this is important is that you can still see that, okay, the group is moving towards a different direction, but is it very radically different than what their founding members did? Are all races actually out of that group?
Mm.
And if you have that foundation, are you actually rid of what is considered right?
Mm.
One of their policies, I mean, the fact that they could even discuss this is
Mm.
disgusting, is that their policy is like, if immigrants commit crime, they should be deported. And I'm like, that's a rule anywhere, right? If you're not a citizen, you commit crime, you should be deported. And not like stealing or anything
Mm.
else, but like
Serious
actual
crime.
murder,
Mm.
rape as well.
Mm. Mm.
However, then they went a step further, which was not taken very well by the Swedes because they're very liberal, which is very nice. It was if um, if even if they're citizens, like by naturalization, their families should also be deported.
Wow.
That includes that if you're a dependent, and that was just ridiculous to me. And I'm like, I can get behind the first part. Any immigrant that commits this crime, sure. If you're deporting them to Syria, then you'd have to ask a question like, it's death or jail time, and depending on the level of crime as well.
Mm.
But then
Well, they can't
you're
do that.
talking of, so no, they
They,
can't.
yeah.
They can't. But we're also in a situation where, can they really not? I
Mm.
mean, Rwanda was so close to happening.
Mm.
It
Mm.
was so close to happening. They spent a lot of money.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
we would have thought as like, definitely this is not going to happen.
Yeah.
But it was so
They
close to
can't.
happening.
It was close to happening, and actually, Rwanda flights goes back to David Blunkett in 2001 that they don't talk about. It was a Labour policy originally, but talking about if you, what I was, you can't send back somebody to a country where there's a death penalty and they could get the death penalty, so that's illegal.
And that's the trouble we have with
Mm.
the Iraqi person who burnt the Quran in Sweden, which
Yeah.
sparked a lot of these.
Mm.
We don't want him. We don't like him here. I mean, I'm for blasphemy. I'm
Mm.
against blasphemy laws,
Mm.
right? But this person's action is just too much. Like,
Mm.
you go through his social media, it's like
Mm.
he's taken a book out of Andrew Tate and talking about how the governments are Islamicized.
Mm.
And I'm just like, I've worked with extremism applications who've been rejected in Sweden, and it's heartbreaking to see that they've actually integrated and learned Swedish and are contributing to the society, and they get a rejection. Afghan young people who had migrated, learned Swedish, went to school, were working a good job, ended
Mm.
up committing suicide because he left, like, he turned to Christianity, and he's like, well, if you're going to send me to Afghanistan, I might as well kill myself.
Mm.
So
Because that's what's
all
going to
these,
happen.
exactly. And he was like this kid was brilliant because I was following his stories, and then just I wake up and he's gone. So I've worked on that cases, like, or like seen and heard of those cases that are actually happening. And when you have the right wing political parties that talk about, oh, maybe we should deport the family, the fact that they could say it is actually like, is it actually
Mm.
is it actually a reality that might not happen?
Mm.
At the same time, we had a lot of like, terrorist attacks or something that, you know, we thought we would have never been, like a lot of us who grew up in safe homes, who were not, part of maybe Wahhabism or, very violent teachings. we thought that could never happen. And then you see that happening, like even in Sweden. And for a Swede where Sweden is a relatively safe country, you could drop your phone and somebody will come and follow and give it to you. That's the biggest thing that could happen. And then you have the right-wing parties talking about it. And even the nicest person who like, oh, I don't want you to go, but I want the other people to go. You know, I think generally Swedish people are very liberal or not as racist as I experience in the UK. So I think in Sweden it's still a bit different, but you still have these conversations happening. And you know, the question is like, okay, so what happens when an ethnic Swede, a white Swede, commits the same crime or worse than a, you know, than a non-white Swede? Where do you deport their families? Because you're talking about their families, like where are you going to deport them? Like,
Yeah, it's a massive conundrum.
Like
I mean,
how are you gonna how are you gonna resolve that?
no, I mean, I don't think you can. It's a similar thing, you know, with the sort of Pakistani grooming gangs in the UK. I don't know how much newspaper column has been written about grooming gangs and how many. I mean, Tommy Robinson, for example, cites it every time. The radio show that you were listening to when I was on, Matthew Goodwin, who went on before me, Zara, he was talking about the grooming gangs. But nobody, you know, and they make the point that, you know, they're all Pakistani. What's the common denominator? They're all Pakistani. This is a culture of grooming, culture of having no respect for women. But what they omit from that is that there are more convicted white grooming gangs that go back many, many decades, including it's still happening now, who are doing exactly the same thing, you know, precisely the same, placating vulnerable women with drugs and alcohol, grooming them into going out with them, and then exploiting them sexually, right? So this has been going on, but you know, to take your point, there's never been, you know, when these cases come up, when the newspapers report them, it's never white grooming gang, it's grooming gang caught in wherever, you know. So this kind of language is very important in creating political identities, I think.
What do you think about the argument of percentage of population? Because I find it very interesting when, you know, I guess British Muslims account for, is it less than 10%?
10.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
British Muslims are much less, 2%. Pakistan, South Asia, Bangladesh 3%. Yeah, it's much less
Let's say
than 10.
10. Let's say
Much
10%.
less. It's much less than 10. Yeah.
Yeah. So British Muslims account for 10%. Immigrants or born, etc. Let's just cluster them all together. However, when it comes to grooming gangs in the past 15 years, I think that's in the past 15 years, are, you know, are accounting for a lot more than the total percentage as well. And that is, I find, a valid argument. However, the mistake happens is that when we take those profiles to be an equation of, you know, the 9.999% of people who are there. But I also think I also think like one of the questions that I always have, and I have these discussions with my family as well, is like, why don't more Muslims talk about this? Like not just the grooming gangs, like in general. You know, we're all appalled. Like you had to preface it, I get it. But there is like the majority of them don't talk about this. And I find that the ones who do are often shut down by the radicals in their own community. You know, the women that are, you know, pushing to, you know, more women rights within their own community are almost shut down or hated by all sides as well.
Yeah. I mean, there's two things I would say. So, firstly, yeah, the percentage argument can be compelling, but I would say it's more linked to nighttime economies, professions, and places. Okay, so yes, as a proportion of the population, Muslims or Pakistani Muslims tend to be doing this more than others. But if you look at the places where it's happening the most, they are very, very, you know, I think it's not 10%. I think it's 7. Muslims are, I think, 3% or 4% of the population, but ethnic minorities together constitute less than 10. So where these grooming gangs are happening tend to be happening in similar places where the same, where white grooming gangs are operating tend to be happening in similar places where Pakistani grooming gangs are happening. So there's a bit more of that we have to look into, in my view. The second point is where you were talking about, people talking about this, Muslims coming out and saying this is terrible. Firstly, obviously, people get issues doing that because why, some random blokes in Oldham or Rotherham are nothing to do with me. We might share the same belief, if you like, but even then that's complicated because they clearly don't believe in the same things that I believe in, because otherwise they wouldn't be treating women and behaving in the way, blah, blah, blah. Then there's more complications. Do you practice what you believe, and blah, 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 right? So lots of Muslims are reluctant to do that because they're like, well, why should we apologize for these morons? The second point is that there is, and this is where I totally agree with you, Zara, there is a real specific cultural thing going on here, right? They tend to be from certain, not even just, this is how absurd it is. Pakistan is a massive place, right? There's it's huge. It's got 180 million population. It's got different regions, different states, different languages, different cultures. And yet when they talk about Pakistani grooming gangs, everybody's encapsulated, right? So I've got lots of Pakistani friends who are outraged by this, and they're wound up by it because they're like, why do they keep saying it's Pakistani? There's not this. I know that this is a particular group of people with particular customs who are from particular areas of Pakistan who've had a particular migration history to the UK who are doing this, right?
Wasn't it found, and I could be wrong, I might have heard it somewhere, that the convicted Pakistani grooming gang leaders were from specific areas. Like they were. It came down to like 3 or 4 areas in Pakistan.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the point I'm making,
Like
right?
that specific. So it was more like localized, not localized, but like they came from that area as well.
Definitely, a lot of them were relatives, right? So they were like part of the Biradri, they were sort of
Was it
extended cousins.
Yeah.
Biradri is like patrilineal system. So yeah, they were related, or they were friends that were related. There were crews that were going around doing these things, right? So then, why, if it's a Muslim issue, why don't we see lots of Bangladeshi grooming gangs? Why don't we see lots of Moroccan grooming gangs? Why don't we see, lots of Nigerian grooming gangs in the UK, right? So, again, look, I don't want to take away from the fact that there are problems within communities in the UK, not just Muslims, but Muslims too, where they have where they are quite misogynistic, right? So they're misogynistic, they're homophobic, they're ableist. There are all sorts of things which are problematic, which are perpetuated by relations in the home, ideas that are passed in the home, etc. So that we need to talk about. And you're right, lots and lots of people don't talk about that. But that's one thing, right? That's a very particular, specific account of very few people compared to the very heterogeneous, complex mix of Muslims that there are in the world, right? So my family originally Bangladeshi. We're not Wahhabi at all. Bangladesh, where I'm from in Sylhet, is it's a very Sufi-oriented place. My parents, my family, we've never ever I was raised in a totally different way to some of these guys that are, implicated in these grooming cases, it seems. And it's not just me. There's millions and millions of, I'm sure hundreds of thousands of households in the UK that are not like this.
Yeah,
But
I know. Like to me, like when I highlighted all of these issues to my family or my community, they were like, it's a Pakistani thing. We also like, even despite being like similar ethnic backgrounds, like in East Africa, we're like Pakistanis. Like
yeah,
we're so good at like, it's like Arabs or Persians or
yeah,
Pakistanis, like like what's happening in Iran. And I come from a Shia background, so they're staunch supporters of the Islamic Republic. And I'm like, guys, did you know this was happening? And my dad's like, no, it's all lies. And then I'm
yeah,
like, oh, but dad, this happened. And it's like, oh, the Iranians, they're probably the bad of them. And I'm like, I get it. Like, it's like we want to push it so far away that we're also unable to fathom, what are the elements of within our own houses, right? It doesn't have to be super homophobic, but a lot of us are like, oh, but if, like, we had this question like, what if your brother was gay, or if you
mm,
found out that your son was gay, how would your family take it?
mm,
Even as a liberal thumb, they're like, oh, as long as it's not my son,
mm,
or as
mm,
long as it's not my daughter, like when it comes to like very close to something that you see as immoral,
mm,
you want to you want to almost shut down.
mm,
You don't want to acknowledge that we might hold prejudice. I grew up in
mm,
Tanzania, right,
mm,
as a brown person and a woman. So racism, being racist, like from my community, and receiving racism was
mm,
my normal day, right?
mm.
Like you go to school, come back, like that was every day. And
Yeah.
it took me living outside to actually know, hey, this is not okay.
Mm,
Also
mm.
challenging the prejudice that we have within our families as well. And
Yeah.
it's such a hard battle, especially if your parents are older or that is a way of life.
Mm, mm,
um, and I
mm,
think we're definitely at a better place in the West where we can challenge this, not just within our own communities, but also within the government as well.
mm,
Like I want to hope, even the Western or the white far right or the right are
mm,
able to talk about this
mm,
without feeling like they're going to get arrested,
mm, mm,
especially if they're not being violent. They should say racist stuff. I mean, I don't like it, but they should be able to say their thoughts so that we can actually counter it.
mm,
Because what's worse is when they don't do it.
mm, mm,
And I think
mm,
likewise with Muslims as well, like you said, the Ali Dawah and the Mohammed hijab, like they're unapologetically out
mm,
there,
mm,
spreading a version of Islam that is quite literally like saying, yes, ex-Muslims should be killed. And I'm like, oh, are we going to do anything about this? Or,
mm, mm,
are we just, I mean, it is their free speech. It's not like they've done it. But what happens is that they give into like, the like you said, the Andrew Tates, I find them very similar, like Mohammed Hijab. They are
mm,
mates anyway.
mm,
They're friends I've done. And I find it very similar. It's that following that get radicalized between them.
mm,
And that's something that a lot of people, don't want to take accountability of.
mm,
Whether it's the Tommy Robinson following, whether it's the Douglas Murray, whether it's the intellectual following of Douglas Murray that feeds
mm,
into those rhetorics that a lot of people don't want to talk about.
mm. No,
When
absolutely.
like
Sorry,
when
I'm
I
just
was in
going.
the oh good.
No, no, I was just going on your point about why don't Muslims talk about it. I mean, obviously, you've been an ex-Muslim. You probably, well, you don't go to the mosque. Sometimes I go to the mosque and I go listen to the sermons. And where my mosque here, they're quite progressive mosque. They don't, again, it's not a sort of Salafist mosque. So they do talk about good things, and it's nice. But we never hear something about. They'll never talk about homophobia, for example. They'll never talk about sexism, for example. They'll never talk about ableism, for example. They'll never talk about issues that, me being a Muslim, I'd expect them to talk about because, these are things that are problematic within our communities. It's not, I mean, it's not just Muslims who are misogynistic, right? The whole world is sexist. It's not just
Well,
Muslims who are racist. Sorry?
now we're seeing a lot of the secular world also going towards that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would argue that we always were, right? So I
Yeah,
don't,
I think they've just been given a platform to verbalize it even
yeah,
more so.
precisely. And before there's this, I mean, I think sexism, racism, all of these things are entrenched within our culture. We're born into racist, sexist, homophobic, all these kinds of cultures. And um, the job, I think, for the Muslim religious class. I mean, I know I'm being really fanciful and fantastical in my thinking and wishes here, but I would expect them to really address some of these issues. And I've got to be fair. Some people are. So, for example, the Liverpool Mosque, the Abdullah Quilliam Mosque, the Imam there, he's very progressive. He talks about this. There are some people that I know that talk about it, but the vast majority, unfortunately, still don't, because the vast majority of the people that we have who are sort of religious leaders now are of the sort of the generation before us. So I'm holding on to hope that when they're replaced by people who are sort of born and raised here, who have progressive ideals, who I would argue really understand the essence of belief and all the real sort of essential values of that, of respect for people, having respect for different people's opinions, having no compulsion, being kind, all of these sort of essential, universally religious ideas. Maybe then we'll have more people coming out and saying, why is it that I my parents said something really racist about black people over dinner one day. I mean, well, how I found that mad because, haven't they looked in the mirror recently?
I, I want to say that I think a few years ago I had this similar hope. Like, when I left Islam, I was like, you know what? The progressive Muslims are going to like really change this. It's going to be a
Mm,
safe environment where we don't have to fear
mm,
each other. And that COVID happened.
mm,
And I feel like a lot of like in general, the younger generations, not that we're very old, but like in
mm,
general, the Gen Zs have
mm,
kind of gone very radical, both ends, whether it's the far
mm,
left or the
mm,
far right.
mm,
I mean, at this point, it's really hard to see the differences. When we talk like cancel culture, like, before COVID was a thing,
mm,
now it's quite literally, you'll see the far left actually, destroying property,
mm, mm,
and, destroying paintings, etc., just to,
mm.
you know, exercise their right to protest, but taking it
Yeah,
further as well. And then you have the far right who will like deport these people,
yeah, yeah,
canceling us in a different way.
yeah, yeah.
Except I feel like with the far, like with the right wing, you expect that, and with the
Mm,
left, the left wing, what we thought was liberal. I don't know how you see it, but I did not expect that because that was a group that I was aligning with,
mm,
or where I thought I best fit in, and that's why it's like, those labels really tend to kind of get a bit more. I want to say decisive or definitive. They get very definitive that it leaves less room for like dissent within those labels as well.
mm, mm. I mean, I think you're correct, especially if you're looking at social media discourse, which is, I mean, Twitter is an absolute cesspit. It's got worse since
But it's
Mastodon.
also
It's
like
terrible.
it's
Very, very
TikTok,
tribal.
it's Instagram, it's
Yeah,
like
it
all of
seems like,
this. But that is the new generation. That
yeah,
that
but
that
what,
is the new
yeah,
generation.
sure. But what I would like to say though is, with my jobs, are I do obviously I teach undergraduates, right? So I teach people, young people from 18 to 21, and then if you become masters, I teach people who are a bit older, mature students. But definitely that sort of 18 and 21 cohort that I teach, I have to say they are nuanced. They don't, obviously, being a teacher, you get to know their ideas, you have conversations with them, and I have to say they give me hope. They're
Mm.
they're total they're totally different
If
to how I was when I was growing up. Sorry, you're saying?
No, I was gonna say if they do go towards the education route as well,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So
like
again, we're
what
looking at a
we
specific group here. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Because
definitely.
I do feel like, I have a, how old is she now? 16, 17. I
Mm,
have a sister, and
mm,
like, I was like, are you gonna study? She's like, yeah, film studies. And I'm like, what do you mean film studies? Here I had to study computer science to
yeah, you're
like
showing your
actually get
age.
my citizen,
Yeah,
and I'm like, I am like the strict parent. I'm like, what do you mean? Like that's not a career. I've also worked,
yeah.
for not a very long time, but Elsa, like that's also like the proportion of people who want to get educated,
Mm,
not just academically, but to actually read books is,
mm,
I think, getting a lot smaller. They're smarter. They are very smarter.
mm,
That when we started using tech, even if it was available, was or like how we, critically thought about things, came to us a lot later than it does for the younger generations. Tech
mm,
has a part to play,
mm,
but also us in this generation have a part to play.
mm,
But I want to say, like, I was that hopeful.
mm,
And I do feel like, the people who are millennials now are still holding on to that middle ground
mm,
more than, the younger or the older
mm,
generations.
mm,
And I
mm,
do hope that, your hopes and wishes, like mine, actually do come to a society where we can live side to side.
mm.
I just feel like it's going to be a long road there. It's going to
Yeah.
require a lot of intervention to actually get there. Because I think social media is going to become our everyday. It
Mm,
has. It's going to be the future. Sadly, like there's
yeah.
no parental controls anymore. There was
Mm,
like no screen time. Like just the parents who had kids like 7 years ago. There was like no controlled screen time, and now you don't have that
mm,
because that's how your
mm,
children get that's how your children get one educated as well. When there's like screen time as well, but there's also you know, a lot out there. Like that's how your kids are like, psychologically they're in tune to watching that.
mm,
And it keeps them going almost as though like it's a bad habit, like sugar,
mm,
for instance. That's how, I think people like social media makes money. That
mm.
is their model, attention.
Yeah, and I think it would take a catastrophe, Zara, before it gets better. So the hope, my hope, it's a fool's hope, but even that hope has to go beyond. You know, it has to negotiate and navigate the barrier of some sort of catastrophe before we get some sense and try to fix the issue. I mean, this
I,
social media thing keeps me up, and I've got two small children. I mean, I've got a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old, and they're not ever getting phones. I know it's unrealistic, it's never going to happen. Everyone's like, no, shut up. But I mean, that's how I'm frightened, how much I'm frightened of this horrible, horrific, exposure that they're going to get to the world, and like you said, it doesn't seem to be abating. Although now it seems, in the aftermath of the riots, it seems that there are um, more questions politically in the UK, certainly, on social media, how to restrict it, regulations, blah blah blah. Seems to be gaining some momentum. So I hope anyway it gets to some point where there is some regulation, or there's ways. I mean, it's still Wild West at the moment, isn't it, Zara?
no, it's
Still.
it's horrible. Even
Mm,
with regulations, like
mm.
like TikTok has my videos banned, and I'm like, oh, I was just talking about a conference. There's nothing in that conference. It's that monopoly. Like I will have like a lot of Islamists that will just go attack. You'll have I have a lot of racists that come
So
into,
people
and
report you then? Is that why you get
yeah,
banned? Ah,
yeah, mass report like TikTok where there is kind of regulation,
right.
But I've also worked a lot with like the tech industries, and I
Yeah.
know that many times it's not a person doing like reviewing the reports, even if they say it is. It's
Uh-huh.
based on algorithm, and a lot of times once the content is removed, there is no saving it. You
Hmm.
know, not Facebook, but like oversight board was like another body there to like
Mm,
for people to appeal and get it back.
mm,
And
mm,
sometimes it works, most time it doesn't.
mm,
However, it's still like in masses though. Even if you do have regulation,
mm, mm.
they're privately owned corporations.
Yeah, yeah. But that's what I mean.
And
There's debates. I don't know how far it will go, but there's discussions going on even considering banning organizations that don't, or companies that don't conform to national jurisdictions, right? So
yeah, I
I
mean,
would
I think
support that if it went down that route. But I mean,
I don't know. It's a
yeah.
bit hard because I feel like if you think about Iranian women,
Mm,
TikTok was the way that they could actually get support,
yeah,
and then they banned it. Like they banned it. They had to use VPN. There are ways around it,
yeah,
and then at the same time, it was how TikTok also kind of allowed the Islamic Republic to find these girls who were
yeah,
dancing. So it was their downfall as well, but
yeah.
ultimately they were like they the younger generation in many ways are much braver than
Yeah,
we
yeah,
are.
totally. I mean, this revolution in Bangladesh that happened last week. It was all done on cyberspace.
Yeah,
So it definitely has its benefit. I mean, you can go back to 2011 and the Arab Spring and all of that. So definitely, I mean, it's a great, amazingly democratic space. And like you, I don't believe in censorship. Okay, I believe people should be able to say whatever they like. If they say something stupid, then it'll be easy to back that away because it's stupid, right? And if they make a complex case, then that's good for everyone because then we can all engage and learn from it. So I don't think, but I think protecting vulnerables is really important, right? So children,
yeah.
um, people with particular health issues, there I think there needs to be some kind of intervention, and I don't know how they're going to
I
do
think
it, but I think it will happen eventually.
so. I think it was Facebook or Twitter when you report a content for harassment and bullying, they have this
Mm,
button where like, do you need support? I thought
mm,
that was quite interesting and actually quite nice. I don't know how many people use it, but I thought that was like one way to, challenge it. But I think ultimately it also requires a change in algorithm as well.
mm,
It does require the change in algorithm because the way social media trends is like when you like only the content that you're going to like or engage with,
mm,
and that requires a much larger change, maybe.
mm, mm, mm.
I had one final question before we
Sure,
go.
sure.
So I want to talk a bit about your book. I
Hmm.
haven't read it, I only read parts of it.
Hmm. Hmm.
But you talk about hybrid identities.
Yeah.
And when you started this conversation, you talked about how, you had the conversation with the boys in Luton, and the first thing they said was they were British dash something like that, that hybrid identity. And then being in a position where they're constantly under a microscope leaves them a bit more isolated. But how do you feel hybrid identities have changed over time? So let's say generations before you and generations after you. Is there more acceptance from within the Muslim community of hybrid identities, but also outside?
Oh, that's a very, very huge question, which I don't know if I'm going to have enough time to fully answer, Zara, but I'll give it a crack. Hybrid identities is something that sociologists and anthropologists and cultural theorists talk about in relation particularly to migration, right? So the idea is the moment you decide to migrate, you and any descendants immediately are no longer from the place of origin. And so you migrate, you find yourself in a position in a society which then you socialize within, and then naturally through that socialization process is you pick up habits, behaviors, attitudes, consciousness, which is an amalgamation of your sort of lived experiences. So if you're from Tanzania, for example, and you came here in the 70s as a 6-year-old, there'll be bits of Tanzania in you that will never leave you, but at the same time you'll become a 1970s, 80s, 2000, whenever you die, you will be a person who is completely contingent and made from those temporal and social parameters in which you live in, right? So hybrid identities, in my view, we've always going to, especially if people are moving, and even if they're not moving, if they're staying in a particular country, attitudes change, society changes. So throughout their lives, who they are, how they identify changes as well. So I think there'll always be this kind of sort of, identities will always be complex in this way, but hybrid identities is particularly more acute when people are, the violence of moving from one place to the other forces people to create a sort of third place, create a sort of mixture of identities. I think in the future, if you're asking about my kids, let's say, who are, my wife is white English, so my children are mixed heritage. Their children in the future, they if they don't leave Britain, they will be totally different to how I am and how my kids are now. But there are some identities that may bind them. For example, if they're still Muslim back then, there might be certain things that they do which will sort of bind their identity. But who knows? What I do know is that what Muslim means then and how people are Muslim then will be different to what Muslim means now and how Muslims are Muslim now. One of the things I think is really interesting in the UK case is this sort of development of UK or British Islam, which is really interesting. I think there's a culture war going on within British Muslim communities of which way to go, right? And it strikes me that the younger generation, people younger than us, basically Gen Z, when I speak to them, when I do my research, I find their views very progressive compared to, I'm talking about Muslim children compared to previous generations, right? So I'll give you a quick anecdote on this. I've got a nephew of mine who grew up in Qatar, in Doha. He's British, but he went over there and grew up there because of his dad's work. And he came back. They've moved back to England now. They've been here for 5 or 6 years. But when he first came over, he's a big F1 fan, and we were watching F1, and we were watching with all his cousins. So there's 10 cousins, big wide range, 30s, 20s, teenagers, children watching the F1. We're talking to him. He's a big fan, and we'll ask him why he doesn't like Lewis Hamilton. And one of the reasons he didn't like Lewis Hamilton was because he was this big advocate for LGBT, for gay rights, queer rights, and it was amazing to watch the other kids educate him. The first visceral response was amazing because they're like, "How can you?" They were shocked, horrified that he would have those views. Then they're like, "Well, this is definitely because of Qatar and Doha, right? So you've just become this backward guy. What's happened to you, and you're not. How can you be part of our family? I hold these views, and blah blah blah." So it was. I didn't have to. I didn't. I just watched it. It was amazing. I did say, "Look, this is what are you? Are you some kind of bigot?" But that was all I. That was probably my, contribution to that conversation. I didn't need to because all the younger, the younger generation took over, and now he's not. He shed those views, right? He was young, so that's so different to my generation when we were growing up. When we were growing up, homophobia was a standard thing. It was a. You wouldn't even think about it as an insult. At school, especially among men. Masculinity, like men, locker room stuff. You'd be like, "Oh, that's gay. Why are you being gay? Oh, that's terrible. You're a bender." Horrible terms. Now, when I think back, I was like, well, actually, this is. I was brought. This is that reflected the racism. Sorry, the homophobia of our society at the time. And I had to, we live in a different society. I had to go off and learn more. I had to sort of look into it. I have to educate myself now to hold the position that I've got now. But it was it was something that I consciously did. Whereas it seems like the younger generation, in this case, say on homophobia, are already, socialized in a way where they're not accepting of these things. So going back to the idea about British Islam, who knows what British Islam would be in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time. I would like, again, I'm being a fool and hoping for the best. I hope it does go to a direction where it is vernacularized. So English, British culture, British Islam is a vernacularization of what is English. British Muslim culture is part of what is English or is Scottish or is Welsh or whatever it is. Is in very much. This has historical precedence as well, because if you go to various parts of the Islamic world now, Indonesian Islam is a certain way, Bengali Islam is a certain way, East African Islam is a certain way. It's very sort of hybrid, mixed in to, it's a lived culture, So I hope something like that will emerge in the future. You have to bear in mind that Muslims in such big population groups is a very new thing, relatively speaking, in the UK. Really, it's not even been 100 years. So post-war period, we had the huge influx of Muslims. Sorry.
I was going to say, I don't think a lot of Muslims even consider themselves to be one either in the UK. There's so many, they're so segregated within themselves, within their own groups. They're just
Absolutely.
like, not me. Like,
Exactly.
it's almost as though it's like, that's not me. Like,
Yeah,
I'm not that kind of Muslim.
Precisely, and they've got a point as well, because like everybody, you live your life, I live my life. If you choose to live your, see Islam in one way, that's fine. If that person sees them in that, fine, and you don't want to associate with them. In a way, I understand that, but at the same time, what we I think British Muslims need to create alliances and coalitions amongst themselves. They need some kind of united voice in order, because when people are being Islamophobic, they don't see whether you're Wahhabi or a Yazidi or a Bora Muslim or a Ismaili or a Ahmadi. They don't care. You're all the same. So as a result of that, there's a need for people to come together and say, okay, well, we're all being seen in this way. We don't like it, but that's the reality. So maybe we should come together and, put down some values.
I think, if anything, that is a much harder
task
than the other way around. As in, like, Muslims being more progressive within their own groups, or like dissenting within their own groups, or finding unity within the non-Muslims.
Yeah.
Or like I guess, forming coalitions with non-Muslims, than like within like I find interfaith, like in Tanzania, like we grew up, we almost never, like, there was no word atheist, right? So I had my own, like, as much as I'd like to think that my community was more progressive, in many ways they weren't, right? Like, I was arrested for no charges in Tanzania, and that was like a shocking thing, because I never expected that would happen in Tanzania. It's a secular country. and they had significant power within politics as well.
mm,
And just within my community as well, like,
mm,
right, there was like there's this exclusionary, like, it's like our community and then other Muslims and then the Christians in Tanzania, almost as though we talk about this interfaith alliance, but we
mm,
don't really talk about it. That just equates to tolerance,
mm,
not acceptance, tolerance. And now more than ever, it's
mm,
worse.
mm,
Like, we've and I'm speaking just specifically in Tanzania, like we've seen more radicalism growing in like the island, like Zanzibar, like a tourist hub,
mm,
where
mm.
they would arrest somebody in a non, like, it's not a Muslim majority, I guess it's Muslim majority island, but it is still a secular country where they would arrest somebody for eating during Ramadan, eating outside.
Really?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I was like,
That's the law. It's the local law, is it?
it's very mixed. So Tanzania is one of those corrupt countries where you can do whatever you want, and that and
Why are
that
people under what powers are they arresting people for
because you can
eating?
do whatever you want.
Right,
Like,
so it's just police doing what they.
yeah, it's police doing whatever they want. Like, my
Mm,
community was one of them, right? Like, my when I was arrested, there were no charges.
mm,
It was just like, what happened. What they
yeah.
didn't know, like what the police didn't know, was they had no idea that I was a foreign citizen visiting my
Right.
parents.
Mm, mm,
And that was like an example of like, is like, that person who was eating was probably Christian.
mm, mm,
And when they arrested them, what happened was the Christians and the Muslims going at it.
mm,
What used to be in harmony was just existent because nobody wanted to talk about it.
mm,
What's happening now is a lot of pent up frustrations on both sides. You'll have the churches making the loudest noises, where I would have assumed it would be the mosques, but the
mm,
loudest noises come from the churches, and then you'll have the Muslims complain about it, and then the Christians, or majority black, will say, well, the brown people, or you're not Tanzanian, you've been there for generations, and it becomes into a race thing as well. So it's so interlaced that
mm,
I feel like interfaith almost never really works, because I think we go around the topic because maybe your view is different, but I feel like religions, like the political side of religions, like any politics, thrive on power.
mm.
They thrive in power. They thrive in keeping the community where they are. They thrive in keeping the people where they are. The
Control.
control that we
Mm,
see within like communities that come from religious leaders who can't accept dissent or differences. They
mm.
thrive because they have that control.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
what happens when you start, releasing a bit of that control, in hopes that, maybe we'll find, more unity, is that it starts shaking the foundation of like, hey, hang on, why are you mixing with the others?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, I almost feel like there will be more alliance outside the Muslim community, with others, if we have the younger generation leading the way, like the anecdote that you just brought up,
Mm,
other kids trying to educate, and I was like, because I
mm,
have that with my sister as well. When we talk about theological women's rights in Islam,
mm,
and she's like, well, I'm a Muslim, but I don't think that it existed, and that we are in a generation or in an era where it's different, and we need to accept that. And that's really nice seeing from like my sister. I'm like, I don't think you're ex-Muslim, like your belief is yours, but it's nice that you've found your space to keep your faith to
mm,
God a personal relation, and
mm,
then still kind of uphold your feminist values as well, or like actually even just think about it, to go like,
mm.
oh, do I believe in this part of the Quran, or was it relevant at that time, and I feel like I'm going in a different direction. But on that note, this was lovely.
Thank you.
It was really nice. I don't know if we had much arguments. I was hoping that would be. I was trying to play the devil's advocate, but I feel like maybe another time.
Yeah, it didn't. It
And
didn't. It didn't work out
no, no,
in that way.
I feel very passionately about migrant rights, and I think that's because I'm an immigrant.
Yeah,
Like all my life, like, or even like my parents, or it was actually my great grandparents. But like
yeah.
I've been in that cycle. But I think what touches me the most is like I cannot be anti-immigration when I work on asylum cases for ex-Muslims,
Mm-mm.
right?
No.
To me, it's just like, I mean, yes, there is a clash of cultures, but not all ex-Muslims hold
Yeah, yeah.
liberal values or are progressive. Now, that is very different to like having the right to live with dignity and in a safe space,
Mm,
like in a safe place.
mm-hmm,
I think that's kind of what it comes down to, even for the um, what I guess we would both agree, the far right nationalists as well. It does come down to them also wanting to live in dignity as well.
mm, mm, mm,
And
absolutely.
the bigger task is actually like trying to educate both sides, because
Mm.
I think that's where we're all struggling. Like we said, nobody wants to hear the middle ground.
Yeah, yeah, and which is why I wanted to thank you, Zara, for inviting me. I think you're doing really good work, and this is exactly the kind of, you've just said it. There needs to be more of this, um, more voices coming out, more nuance.
You know, when,
Uh,
when I do podcasts
yeah.
and, with non-Muslims,
Mm,
and, if they're a bit centrist,
mm,
they're always one to talk about like, you know, bad Muslims. And I have a fair share, like, experience of bad Muslims. But
mm.
I always come off as a Muslim in that argument because I'm always in defense of, like, the dissenters in Islam who are actually leading the path. I
Yeah,
mean, ex-Muslims are technically, considered as part of the Muslim groups for people who can't differentiate them.
yeah, yeah.
We have Muslim names. So we are still also dissenting within our own communities, also countries as well.
Mm,
And we are being shut down by the same group that you're complaining
mm,
about.
mm, mm.
Voices like you and like yourself and mine are being shut down by the same groups,
Yeah, yeah,
whether it's the far right or the Islamists as well.
absolutely, absolutely. And
Um,
what's important is if if you strive for the truth, if you have good intentions throughout, you do come across contradictions and conundrums and paradoxes, and that I think that's very
I think that's
healthy human
yeah,
condition.
yeah. I think I think that's how people should, like, strive to be, because if
Mm,
we're always correct or if we're always so right in our views,
mm.
I don't think we're learning or growing.
No, and it's impossible to be that as well. Just to add,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But thank you so
thank you so
much. This
much.
was
Thank you.
great. I am excited to see where you do go with your work. I will try reading the book. I
Likewise, thank
read
you
bits
so
of
much.
it.
No, no, please, thank you for reading. You don't have to read it, but again, thank you for inviting me. It was really lovely to have this chat, and I wish you all the best, all the success. Hopefully, we'll speak again.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. I'll just end the live. Thank you all for joining. I know we didn't take any questions, but it was going in different directions.
Thank you, everybody.
But I think the chat was nice. So even if people watch it after the live, I think it'll still be quite fruitful as well.